And now we turn to the more picturesque subject of travellers' tales. Since early last century, the Tuamut Valley has been visited by a stream of travellers, many of them men and women of distinction, who have told some of the features in their books. True, some of their visits have not been an unmixed blessing. Dr. Stewart occasionally referred to what we would now call their nuisance value, for they were apt to pick up a few current and untested opinions about missionary work, transfer them to their journals, and reproduce them in their books when in due or undue course these appeared. One of them, out of the mass of accounts left by travellers, I select first Liechtenstein's description of his meeting with Chief Geiger and the impression the chief made upon him. Liechtenstein's book of travel is, of course, one of the most famous and monumental among Afrikaner. He visited the district about 1805 and gave the following account of the chief's personal appearance. Geiger is one of the handsomest men that can be seen, uncommonly tall, with strong limbs and very fine features. His countenance is expressive of the utmost benevolence and self-confidence, united with great animation. There is in his whole appearance something that one speaks the king, although there was nothing in his attire to distinguish him except some rows of white beads which he wore round his neck. It is not hazarding too much to say that among the savages all over the globe a handsomer man could scarcely be found. Nay, one might go further and say that among the sovereigns of the cultivated nations it would perhaps be difficult to find so many qualities united worthy of their dignity. His fine, tall, well-proportioned form at the perfect age of 26, his open, benevolent, confiding countenance, the simplicity yet dignity of his deportment, his views, his frankness, and the views he took of things, all these properties combined are not often to be found among those who, according to our commonly received opinions, have had infinitely greater advantages to the forming of their persons and minds. A large and notable book of travel is entitled A Narrative of a Visit to the Mauritius and South Africa by James Backhouse. The author and his friend George Washington Walker were Quakers who visited this country in 1839. In the course of their wanderings they came to Lovedale just when the seminary, as it was called, was being built. They were guests at what is described as Block Drift in Tuamut Vale, the residence of Charles Lennox Stretch, the government diplomatic agent. This house is mentioned as a neat stone house, erected at Stretch's own cost on land ceded to him by the native chief. The district was then much interested in a new water scheme. Backhouse gives a good deal of attention to Stretch's agricultural efforts, and particularly of his cutting of water ditches or slopes. By such ditches he had irrigated a considerable portion of land. Backhouse and Walker were particularly interested in Stretch's biggest effort at water ditch or slope making, by which he planned to irrigate 1,000 acres. Stretch found the work, however, too much for him. Backhouse continues, being satisfied of its importance, we made application to some of our friends, capital F, Quakers, in England, who kindly assisted him in this benevolent undertaking, and the ditch was completed in 1841. After watering the lands of the adjacent missionary station of Lovedale, the stream is conveyed over the dale of the Gaga River in wooden troughs to a large plain which it fertilizes. That furrow is still running today, and the good people of Alice are largely dependent upon it for the watering of their gardens. A rich mine of literary reference, a mine with many seams, is found in the biographies of governors of Cape Colony who for longer or shorter periods came to the eastern part of the country. In the lives of Sir George Grey, Sir Bartle Frere and others, this part of the country, the Chumé Valley, is very frequently figured. One finds, for example, correspondence between the Reverend William Govan and Sir George Grey concerning the latter's interest in native literature. Mr. Govan declares that he and his fellow missionaries expect most important results from the Governor's researches and measures. Today, the Grey collection in the South African Public Library of Cape Town is a standing memorial of how Mr. Govan's expectations were fulfilled. I will select for particular mention one governor, the somewhat melodramatic Sir Harry Smith. In his autobiography appears a passage from a book written by his friend Kincaid, in which an incident of the Spanish War of 1812 is mentioned and fully set out. The passage, known no doubt to many of you, reveals how a local mountain which abuts on the Chumé Valley was named. Kincaid says, I was conversing with his friend at the door of a hut. I was conversing with a friend at the door of his tent when we observed two ladies coming from the city who made directly towards us. They seemed both young, and when they came near, the elder of the two threw back her mantilla to speak to us, showing a remarkably handsome figure with finest features, but sallow, sunburnt, careworn, though still youthful in countenance. She showed that in her the time for tender thoughts and soft endearments had fled away and gone. She at once addressed us in that confident, heroic manner so common among high-bred Spanish maidens, told us who they were, the last of an ancient and honourable house, and referred to an officer high in rank in our army who had been quartered there in the days of her prosperity, for the truth of her tale. Her husband, she said, was a Spanish officer in a distant part of the kingdom, who might or might not be still living. Only yesterday she and this her sister were able to live in affluence and in a handsome house. Today they knew not where to lay their heads, or where to get a change of raiment or a morsel of bread. Her house, she said, was a wreck, and to show the indignities to which they had been subjected, she pointed to some blood which was stealing down their necks, caused by the wrenching of their earrings through the flesh by the hands of worse than savages who would not take the trouble to unclasp them. For herself, she said, she cared not, but for the agitated and almost unconscious maiden by her side, whom she had lately received from her conventual teachers. She was in despair and knew not what to do. And that in her pain and ruin, which was at that moment desolating the city, she saw no security for her but the seemingly indelicate one she had adopted of coming to the camp and throwing themselves upon the protection of any British officer who would afford it. And so great, she said, was her faith in our national character that she knew her appeal would not be made in vain, nor could it be abused, for she stood by the side of an angel, a being more transcendingly lovely I had never before seen, one more amiable I have never yet known. Kincaid goes on. 14 summers had not yet passed over her youthful countenance, which was of a delicate freshness, more English than Spanish. Her face, though not perhaps rigidly beautiful, was nevertheless so remarkably handsome and so irresistibly attractive, surmounting a figure cast in nature's fairest mould, that to look at her was to love, and I did love her. But I never told my love, and in the meantime another and a more impudent fellow stepped in and won her. But yet I was happy, for in him she found such a one as her loveliness and her misfortune claimed, a man of honour, and a husband in every way worthy of her. The impudent fellow and man of honour was Sir Harry Smith, and the Spanish girl was his wife Joanna, after whom the mountain Johannesburg in the Tume Valley is named. They were married when he was 24 and she just turned 14. Though concerning her youthfulness, Sir Harry remarks, in southern climates nature more early develops herself and attains maturity. 33 years afterwards, he declared that his maddening love for her had never abated. She had been his guardian angel, sharing with him the dangers and privations, the hardships and fatigues of a restless life of war in every quarter of the globe. Sir Harry's ideas for effecting the conversion of the Bantu were nothing if not original. Whether they would have been ultimately successful is another question. He declares that the chief Charlie, it was Charlie who originally gave the land on which Lovedale Institution stands, Charlie attended divine service every Sunday in the English clothes Sir Harry gave him. Had I remained long enough, as cultivation and sale progressed, I would have built churches, and by feasts and slaughtering cattle have induced all influential men to attend. And he had another means at hand. He noted that the Bantu were great lovers of music. He said, "I have been wonderfully amused at observing the effect the playing of our bands had on many who had never heard them before. Some would laugh immoderately, some weep, some stand riveted to the spot, others in a sort of vibrating convulsion, others would dance and sing. All were animated and excited beyond measure. Thus, with the aid of music, I should have made some advance towards Christian conversion." This optimistic view is dashed with disappointment for Scotsmen when they read the Bantu verdict on the music of the bagpipes. Sir Harry Smith says, "When poor Hintsa heard the bagpipes of the 72nd, he closed his ears with his hands and said, 'This is to make people weep. I like the bugles and the trumpets. When I hear them, I feel like a man.'" And it is added, the Highland piper was ordered to play for Hintsa's amusement. Hintsa was asked what he thought of the music. He answered that some of it reminded him of his children at home and made him weep, and that he supposed the instrument had been invented by us out of respect for the generals of Benjamin Durban, to imitate his weeping when he was a little boy and to remind him of the crying of his children. This slander on the bagpipes is one of the few impolite things I've ever heard credited to an African. And yet, are not laments among the most characteristic of bagpipe music? And do we not speak of their wail? Is there not here indeed another tribute to Bantu power of observation? Continuing our traveller's tales, but apart from governors, one of the most notable literary figures that ever visited the Tume district was Anthony Trollope, whose 2 volumes on his South African tour afford much of interest and amusement to the reader even today. In the course of his travels in 1876, he left Grahamstown on a hired Cape cart bound for Fort Beaufort. He describes how on the way he passed Fort Brown, which seemed to him set in a scene of desolation. He found living there the wife of a policeman, and of her he said, "A more lonely creature I never saw." He adds, "She was clean and pleasant and talked well, but she declared that unless she was soon liberated from Fort Brown, she must go mad." I may say that one of our experiences was to have Helen Keller stay with us for a weekend. And on the way from Grahamstown to Alice, it is said that as she passed through by Fort Brown and so on, this blind, deaf woman said, "I sense the loneliness of Africa." Trollope tells how he intended sleeping at Fort Beaufort and then to go up the Katzberg Mountains. But he was prevented by the coming of a gentleman, a Wesleyan minister, who was very anxious that he should see the school at Heeltown over which he presided. From first to last through my tour, says Trollope, I was subject to the privileges and inconveniences of being known as a man who was going to write a book. I never said as much to anyone in South Africa, or even admitted it when asked. I could not deny that I possibly might do so, but I always protested that my examiner had no business to assume the fact. All this, however, was quite vain. The argument, though never expressed in plain words, would take in suggested ideas the following form. Here you are in South Africa, and you are going to write about us. If so, I, or we, or my, or our institution have an absolute claim to a certain portion of your attention. You have no right to pass our town by, and then to talk of the next town merely because such an arrangement will suit your individual comfort. When all this was said on behalf of some very big store, or perhaps in favour of a pretty view, or has been the case in pride at the possession of a little cabbage garden, I have been apt to wax wroth and to swear that I was my own master. But a missionary school, to which some earnest Christian man, with probably an earnest Christian wife, devotes a life in the hope of making fresh water flow through the dry wilderness, has claims, however painful they may be at the moment. This gentleman had come into Fort Beaufort on purpose to catch me, and as he was very eloquent, and as I did feel a certain duty, I allowed myself to be led away by him. I fear that I went ungraciously, and know that I went unwillingly. It was just 4 o'clock, and having had no luncheon, I wanted my dinner. I had already established myself in a neat little sitting room in the inn, and had taken off my boots. I was tired and dusty and about to wash myself. I had been on the road all day, and there was a pretty young lady at the inn who had given me a cup of tea to support me till dinner should be ready. I spoke to the minister of my dinner, but he assured me that an hour would take me out to his place at Heeltown. He clearly thought and clearly said that if it was my duty to go, and I acceded. He promised to convey me to the establishment in an hour, but it was 2 hours and a half before we were there. He allured me by speaking of the beauty of the road, but it was pitch dark all the way. It was 8 o'clock before my wants were supplied, and by that time I hated Kaffir children thoroughly. Trollope could spend very little time at Heeltown, and the next morning was on his way to Alice. We shall not linger over his description of Lovedale, which he declared to be a place which has had and is having very great success. He described how its schools were conducted very much like English schools, with the exception that no classes were held after the 1 o'clock dinner. He said that sitting at the high table in the boys' dining hall, he himself had a very good dinner. And he goes on, I was taken through the dormitories, and the beds are neat enough with their rug coverings. I did not like to search further by displacing them. But I cannot leave Trollope without telling what befell him in Alice. He says, near to Lovedale is a little town of Alice, in which I stayed 2 days with a hospitable doctor. He took me out for a day's hunting, as it is called, which in that benighted country means shooting. I must own here to have made a little blunder. When I was asked some days before whether I would like to have a day's hunting for me got up in the neighbourhood of Alice, I answered with alacrity in the affirmative. Hunting, which is the easiest of sports, has ever been an allurement to me. To hunt as we hunt at home, it is only necessary that a man should stick on the back of a horse, or failing that he should fall off. When hunting was offered to me, I thought that I could at any rate go out and see. But on my arrival at Alice, I found that hunting meant shooting, an exercise of skill in which I had never even tried to prevail. "I haven't fired a gun," I said, "for 40 years. He tried to get out of the hunt, but found that all arrangements had been made, including provision for the presence of 100 naked Africans to beat up the game. So he took the gun and carried it ever so many miles on horseback, to his very great annoyance. He was posted to a spot where he was told the buck would soon pass, but after holding his gun alert for 30 minutes, nothing came and he went to sleep. Indeed, during the whole day, nothing appeared before his eyes at which he could fire. The day's bag for well over 100 men was, he tells us, a bird, a hare, and a very fat monkey of a peculiarly blue colour about his hindquarters. But Trollope admitted that the natives who took part were as naked as his heart could desire, and to them the day's hunt was a day of unalloyed bliss. Before mentioning some of those who did purely creative work, let me just touch on one or two of those who brought distinction to our district by their historical and other research. One of the most famous literary personages was Dr. George M. Thiel, the famous historian. He served in Lovedale in a double capacity of teacher and printer from 1871 till 1877. While at Lovedale, he became deeply interested in native history, and in 1874 he published through the Lovedale Mission Press the first history of South Africa. This history was an extension of a pamphlet printed in 1871, and was the first attempt to deal with the story of South Africa in a scientific manner. It is interesting to recall that not only did Thiel write this book in Lovedale, but the work of setting it in type was largely done by his own hands in the Lovedale printing office. Thiel's book met with the most favourable reception, and in 1876 and 1877, second and third editions were called for. All three were printed in Lovedale. They were the first volumes. They were the first of a long series of over 30 volumes, dealing with almost all aspects of colonial history. Later on, he enlarged the scope of his enterprise and dealt in a masterly manner with the Portuguese records, as these touched on the earlier history of the Cape. His historical judgments have not always been endorsed in later times, but what he accomplished in the research will ever remain a monument to his industry, to his patience, and to his high sense of duty. I'm afraid I'm to overleap my time. Yes. We may claim as having within our district a veritable master of pure prose. Here we come to strictly creative literature, and the author to whom I refer is no other than Olive Schreiner. When a child of 6, she came to Heeltown, 9 miles from Lovedale, to which her father had been appointed missionary in charge. Previously he had been missionary at Wittenbergen, and it was there Olive was born. Some of the most formative incidents of Olive Schreiner's life occurred during her years at Heeltown and in Balfour, Greykirk and Herzog, where the family later resided. It was at Heeltown that as a child she came upon the Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter of Matthew and read it with amazement and delight. She embodies this in the story of an African farm. It reflected, put into definite language, much that she as a child had vaguely felt. So she rushed to her mother in great excitement and said, "Look what I found, look what I found. It's what I've known all along. Now we can all live like this." It was at Heeltown that her little sister Ellie died when 2 years old, and the older child of 9 used to spend much of her time sitting at the grave and talking to the child that had gone. What Olive Schreiner's husband describes as her chief novel, From Man to Man, is dedicated to my little sister Ellie. I will mention only one or two others. A local poet of more than local celebrity was William Elijah Hunter, rector of Alice from 1886 till 1909. He was born in Somersetshire, came to South Africa in 1861, and died at Cambridge, Cape Province, in 1913. He was the author of The Nightingale and Other Poems, a volume published in 1908. He is worthy of remembrance as a poet of unusual depth of feeling and delicacy of expression. I think it will be agreed that his little short-line poem, Death's Silence, is a gem. Not death I feared, if this be death cold at my breast, but, oh, my darlings, lest in some great hour of sorest need, of bitterest pain ye call on me, and I not hear, or hear in vain, having no power to speak one word that might break through death's silence and be heard and known of you. One of the best known of our local poets was Francis Carey Slater, who was born near Alice and received part of his education at Lovedale. During his career as poet, novelist, short story author, and anthologist, he published about a dozen volumes, all with their setting in South Africa. He is undoubtedly one whose name will stand in South African literature for many and many a year. Now I could mention others. Sir John, going a little further afield in the Alice district, Sir John Adamson, Kingsley Fairburge, Sir Percy Fitzpatrick, who was born at King Williamstown, Edmund Gard, Thomas Pringle, the Honourable Victor Sampson, William Archer Way, V.F. Stent, not to mention Edgar Wallace, who was connected with East London in his early days. He was a journalist here. Perhaps you've heard of someone visiting in Scotland, and they came near Stirling, and somebody pointed to the Wallace Monument, to Sir William Wallace, of course, up on beside the castle, and said, "There's the Wallace Monument." And the visitor said, "Good old Edgar." Now let me close just with this. Perhaps there are few rural districts in South Africa, perhaps there is none, that can show so great a galaxy of literary figures. As one travels the familiar roads of the Chumé Valley and its environs, we look on scenes that were dear to men and women, many of them now passed from us, men and women who had the artist's mind and the poet's heart. They saw visions and they dreamed dreams, and something of what they saw and what they dreamed they have left to us. And we, to our great enrichment, we know them. In imagination we see them, and they make sacred the very soil on which we walk, because of what they were. The lines have fallen to us in pleasant places, and we have a goodly heritage. Shall we not hold them in honour and keep their memories undimmed by sleep, as Francis Carey Slater said?
Ladies and gentlemen, you know in the Xhosa nation, on an occasion like this, they appoint a mbongo to sing the notable's praise after he has done his bit. And tonight it's my privilege to thank Dr. Shepherd for coming these 80-odd miles, accompanied by a fellow citizen. I see Mr. Cooper sitting there in the corner, giving Dr. Shepherd no doubt moral support. Dr. Shepherd, you've given us a really very marvellous talk on the literary fields of Alice. You have covered everything, I think, and I'm sure in preparing this talk you enjoyed it as much as giving it to us. We are very privileged that your talk has been recorded so ably by Mr. Hogard, not only for us to listen to, perhaps in a few years' time to refresh our memories, but for those who are coming on in a few generations' time. I think that's a very good thing to record talks such as this. You have mentioned many names in your talk, but I think you omitted one person, and she also comes from Alice, that is Noni Jibalvu. Ladies and gentlemen, and Dr. Shepherd, thank you very much for your very nice talk.